As you move into your later years, the twilight of your life, what are the most important issues that you must face to have a successful and satisfying retirement and post-retirement? So we have with us Bob Malderstock, Bob Shaney, and Bob Weber, all Princeton 1968 grads. I'm going to turn the wisdom over to my colleague, Bob Malderstock.
I've practiced and worked with clients for over 30 years. And during that period of time, I've built up a checklist that I use with clients to help them prepare for and reach retirement. So I want to cover some of the key issues with you that I got from that work and that checklist. Most of us don't want to think about the possibility that someday either ourselves or our spouse will need long-term care. But guess what? Many of us will. So there's 3 questions you have to answer related to long-term care. First question is, if myself or my spouse or partner are physically or mentally incapacitated, can we still live in our current home? Second question is, if myself or my spouse need a caregiver, who's going to provide that care? Third question is, if I need care, who's going to pay for it? How do I pay for it? I don't know about the costs here in Washington, D.C., but in Massachusetts, where I live, the cost of being in an assisted living is between $8,000 to $10,000 a month. Another issue that I think is really important, and one that we try to ignore for as long as possible, is end-of-life planning. No one wants to talk about the end of life. If you look here on the list, I've got 2 great resources for helping you deal with this issue. One is called The 5 Wishes. It's written by an organization called Aging with Dignity, and I've got a copy here. I would suggest that you go to that website, agingwithdignity.org, and download a copy of this 5 Wishes and fill it out for yourself, and then share it with your family. The last thing that I'll mention to you is maybe the most important part. It's conducting a family meeting. Once you conduct a meeting with your family and talk about the things that we've just talked about today, these issues, my long-term care plan, my end-of-life plan, my retirement plan, talk to your family about those issues and share with them what you want at a family meeting is very powerful. It'll change your relationship with your family totally. The most important gift you can give your children is communication. Communication with them about what's important to you.
It's wonderful to be here. It's wonderful to be, I guess, is the way to start. We've had, all of us, wonderful journeys. Some of us sort of together, some of us always together because we knew each other before, and we're very lucky. I'll start out with that. We're all lucky because we look like we're fairly healthy, and my mission is supposed to talk about health, which I will do. So in medical school, there was a very famous academic physician who was, I think, chief of medicine at Massachusetts General, named Alexander Leaf. And he was writing articles, scientific articles, as well as articles in Scientific American and National Geographic, on a sabbatical he did in areas of the world where people were purported to live very long. And the populations all lived at about 5,000 feet, which isn't very high, but to me that was great. In Ohio, it was 500 feet. So what he did was, on the sabbatical, he took a medical team and he went to Ecuador in the Vilcabamba region, where people were purported to live very long. He went to the Hunza region in Pakistan in the Hindu Kush Mountains, and he then went to Georgia in Russia. And I've been to a couple of those areas since then, but these people had records of living 90s and over 100, and probably pretty accurate. He found these people were very active physically. They had to be. That was the life that they embraced. You couldn't sit around. The older people got, they were raised and elevated in their community. they were the ones who were respected and looked up to. They weren't turned out to pasture. One of the things, a study that we published, I think in 2000 in the Journal of Physiology, we did in Seattle, where we wanted to test the hypothesis that when you get to a certain age, say 65 or above, you can't train. Your androgens are down, this is men and women, you just can't do all that. So we took a group of older folks without heart and lung disease, but not necessarily active, from age 65 to 92. We took a group of 30-year-olds, same number, and then we divided each of those groups into a training group where we did both aerobic training and strength training, and this isn't pumping iron, this is just something. And the other half of each group just went about their lifestyle. What we found was that the training group and the older folks could improve their aerobic capacity the same percentage as the 30-year-olds. Most of my clinical time, I see outpatients with heart and lung disease and exercise problems and teaching in that scenario, but I also spend a lot of time in the intensive care unit. What is very interesting is that there are many more really older people in the ICU that get admitted to the ICU than during most of my career. And it comes up with a terrible conundrum because families have not talked about what they want. And I will tell you, when you're impaired or really sick and you can't make decisions, don't trust your family. And no, seriously, and don't trust your doctor. The hardest thing is you go into the room and grandpa's sick. And you know after all these years of experience, grandpa's not doing well. And family said, well, he's a fighter. And that means, oh God, this is going to be a long hill to climb. Because no family wants to say, why don't you unplug grandpa? Or why don't you make him comfort care? Why don't you get palliative care? Because there's guilt. You don't want to be responsible either up front or years later of playing a role in grandpa's death. But none of us is going to get out of this alive. And the point I'd like to emphasize is whatever time we have, and everybody in this room looks pretty healthy, but something's going to happen. You want to give dignity to that part and some functionality. How do you orchestrate end of life in a dignified way? The healthcare team has to do that. The courage and art of what we do is to know when not to do or when to give it a shot, but be willing to withdraw that. The story that I'll finish with, and then I'll show you what Alexander Leaf came up with, is my father. He was, like all fathers, a wonderful man. He was a physician at Ohio State, professor of medicine, and during my training, he used to kid me, how can you train out west? There aren't any hospitals west of Mississippi. So, but he was very proud that I was going to Seattle. But the point is, when I was a pulmonary fellow, he developed a cancer that was pretty aggressive. And so that year, it was in my research year, so I could schedule time to go back to Columbus just to visit him. And I had been asked as a fellow to give medical grand rounds at the university, which was pretty unheard of on some topic that I was doing. But I needed to go see my father. I said, Dad, I'm going to come. I'm not going to give grand rounds. I'm going to cancel. I'm going to come see you. He said, no, you're not. You're going to stay there and give grand rounds, and then you can come see me. So I went out that weekend, and he was sick. Totally with it mentally, but you could tell he was wasting. And he's in the hospital bed. And he said, son, the oncologists have this new experimental drug they want to give me. And he paused and said, I want you to take me home. So that Saturday morning, he walked slowly, but he walked to the car, drove him to the house that he built that we grew up in Eastmoor, not far from where Mark lived in Bexley. And he walked into the house and he stayed there for 6 weeks until he died. The point is, he took control of that part of his life with great dignity. And I think of this story a lot because I'm dealing with this kind of patient all the time. And I learned a lot more than I learned in medical school about life and death from that decision of a man who had dignity and wanted control.
All right. Interesting conversation I had with one of the participants today who said, that's an awfully optimistic title you've got there. Success in your second half of life. Really? Success in your second half of life. Well, I guess it depends on what we mean by success. Do we mean success by what we mean in the first half of life? Or is there a success that occurs or has the potential for occurring in the second half of life? And I think that's what this domain, that is the spiritual, existential, gets to. There is success, but not in the way that was the measure in the first half of life, which all of us here, I think, have managed to do. We succeeded in the first half of our lives, not without failure, but succeeded in our lives. So what is it? So thank you, you who made that comment earlier, because you flipped the switch for me in a good way. In the first half of life, at least for me, it was about learning how to become a human doing. Do. Right? Isn't that what we wind up doing? Well, that's important. There's nothing wrong with being a human doing. Even at this age, if there are things that you still need to do, want to do, that you feel can make a contribution to others or contribute to your own sense of life, then do. However, build it on what the second half of life, I think, allows us to work toward in a much deeper way, which is becoming the human being we are. The human being in a much more deeply philosophical, existential, if you will, or spiritual sense. Nothing wrong with what we have to do in the first half of life, which is to do and to become something that will be of some value in the culture and society, or to our families, or to our kids. That's all very essential. But then in the introduction, you remember that Bob Farron, one of the four Bobs, said, you know, that I had been a Jesuit. And I was for 10 years. I entered, I took vows, I studied theology, I was going to be ordained a priest. I held off ordination because there was something not right. Although I was raised in a Catholic family, an altar boy, you know, I knew how to fold my hands perfectly. All of those things. And my father, whom I loved so passionately, his dream for me was to become a priest, a Catholic priest, that than which nothing greater could be conceived in a Catholic family at the time. That was the 1950s, 60s. And when I left, when I decided, I took a leave of absence and then made the decision to leave and to break out of prison. But when I left, my father was, frankly, on the one hand, disappointed and also angry. You know, what was I doing? Abandoning the dream, his dream for me. And it took him about 3 years. I mean, we still maintained a relationship. It wasn't a cutoff. But it took him for 3 years to finally say to me one day, all I've ever really wanted for you, Bob, is your happiness. I think what we're trying to do, Bob, and Bob, and Bob, and Bob, is invite you to ask yourself questions so that you can look within yourself and have these answers within yourself let out from within. How have I become, another question, a better human being, living more fully, freely, and wisely as a result of the struggles I've gone through, the sufferings I've borne with, and the questions I've asked myself and continue to ask myself? I don't think I'm ever going to stop asking questions. I never get a final definitive answer. But I always learn something and always grow.